Hi there. Thank you for joining me on the second part of the videos on lymphatic system. On this video we will be focusing on lymphoid tissues, first talking about lymph nodes and then lymphatic organs. You might remember that we finished our last video by talking about lymphoid cells. Now we are moving to a little larger scale and we'll start by looking at lymphoid tissues. And as usual, I want to start by considering the main functions of lymphoid tissues. So these tissues provide sites where the lymphocytes are housed, as well as a site where they can proliferate in response of a need. Another function would be lymphoid tissues providing a surveillance site where lymphocytes and macrophages can filter through the lymph. So those are our main two functions. And in case you were wondering about the tissue types, which we saw earlier on in our studies, and I will include a link to the end of this video if you have forgotten the main tissue types, lymphoid tissues are largely composed of reticular connective tissue. This is a type of loose connective tissue. And macrophages live on the reticular fibers, while lymphocytes occupy the spaces between the fibers when they return to the lymphoid tissue after patrolling the body. There are two types of lymphoid tissues. General tissue, which is found almost everywhere in the body, and specialized tissue, which gives rise to the lymph nodes and lymphatic organs. Let's start by looking at the lymph nodes. Lymph nodes are glands of an immune system. They typically enlarge in response to a bacterial or viral infection. And they contain a high concentration of lymphocytes and macrophages, so their function is to fight pathogens. And there are hundreds of nodes that are found throughout the body. They are often found as groups or chains by the large lymphatic vessels. And if we wish to define their function a bit more, we can find a twofold function: to filter the lymph so that we can clean it. This would be removing potentially harmful pathogens from the lymph. And the second function would be related to the immune system by activating it. This is where macrophages and lymphocytes play a key role. So where in the body do we find lymph nodes? Let's talk a little bit about this. Well, as I said, lymph nodes are often found as clusters, and therefore they are named on many occasions based on their location. Let's have a look at some of these. First, cervical lymph nodes. Well, this would be at the neck, and a common site to test if your lymph nodes are swollen. You might recall this from your doctor's visit, right? And axillary, of course, refers to our armpit, as you remember. There are a lot of lymph nodes that are easily accessible to feel there too. Then we have supratrochlear lymph nodes above the trochlear notch, so at cubital fossa, the opposite side of an elbow. Inguinal lymph nodes are located at the groin area, another region where it is easy to feel these lymph nodes. Abdominal is probably quite self-explanatory, I guess, so at the abdominal region. And finally, thoracic lymph nodes at the thorax. So that is some lymph node regions that might be good to know, as they are commonly used. And just as a curiosity, because I think this is what was interesting, of course animals have lymph nodes too. Here we see easily palpable regions of lymph nodes in cats. Okay, now let's have a look at the lymph nodes in a little greater detail. So these are small and round blobs, if you wish to describe them as such. Many say that their shape looks a little like beans. They are small, as I said, less than 2.5 centimeters in size. For those of you who are not totally familiar with the metric scale, this would be about 1 inch. So that size or smaller. Another thing to notice is that there is a capsule around lymph node. This is fibrous, and fibers from the capsule extend inwards a structure called trabeculæ. These divide the lymph node into separate compartments. And finally, I want to highlight that we have two histologically distinct regions in a node, more external cortex and more internal medulla. And now we will discuss these two regions in a little more detail. But before we do, I want to show a really nice histological view of a section of a lymph node. Notice that we have used different stains to highlight different regions, and then we have taken photomicrograph of it for you. So, what we need to know about cortex and lymph node? Well, as I said earlier, these are superficial areas of the node, and they contain follicles with germinal centers which are heavy with dividing B cells. Deep cortex then again houses T cells in transit. Think about it, T cells circulate continuously among blood and lymph nodes and lymph. Another thing that we see in the cortex is that there are abundant numbers of dendritic cells, which are closely associated with T and B cells. They play a role in activating both lymphocytes. So that is our cortex. Let's have a look at the medulla. In medulla, the medullary cords, which originated from the cortex, extend inwards. They contain B cells, T cells, and plasma cells. Finally, I will mention that we also find lymph sinuses throughout the node. Remember, the term sinus referred to an opening in an anatomical language, and these lymph sinuses are openings where macrophages live to screen lymph. Before we leave the topic of lymph nodes, I want us to have a look at this figure. It shows a longitudinal view of structures within a lymph node, as well as some associated lymphatics. And from this diagram, I wanted to highlight that lymph enters on the convex side of the node through afferent lymphatic vessels. And then it travels through it and leaves at the concave side at hilum through efferent lymphatic vessels. And the clinical relevance, of course, has to do with the lymph nodes swelling when they are filled with white blood cells in an infection. And this is what your doctor will probably test when they feel your neck, for example. Interestingly, lack of pain when touched in an inflamed lymphatic gland can be an indication of cancer. However, this is not quite as clear-cut, so do not start to panic and feel yourself. There is more to it. So, that's our lymph nodes. And what I want us to do next is that we should look at various lymphatic organs. And we will talk about each one briefly. And if you want more detail, you can refer back to your textbook. So let's start with the spleen. It is a blood-rich organ located in the left side of the abdominal cavity, just below the stomach. In terms of the size, it's about fist-sized. This makes it actually the largest lymphoid organ in the body. And as I said, it receives a lot of blood that goes through it. Let's have a look about this. So, the spleen is served by splenic artery and vein, which enter and exit at the hilum. And now we should have a look at some of the functions that are associated with the spleen. It is a site of lymphocyte proliferation and immune surveillance and response. Also, spleen cleanses the blood of aged blood cells and platelets, with macrophages removing the debris. Here we see some further functions. You will see that spleen stores breakdown products of red blood cells for later use, and a good example of this would be iron. In addition, spleen stores blood platelets and monocytes for release into the blood whenever they might be needed. And a final one that I wanted to mention is the role of spleen in the production of red blood cells in the fetus. So now that we have gone through a general description of the spleen's location and appearance, as well as some of its functions, let's dive a little deeper. On a histological level, spleen consists of two compartments, white and red pulp. White pulp is the site where immune functions occurs. It contains mainly lymphocytes on reticular fibers. Red pulp instead is the site where old blood cells and blood-borne pathogens are destroyed. It is rich in red blood cells and macrophages that engulf them. One example of clinical relevance that came to my mind results from the fact that spleen has a very thin capsule around it. As a result, direct blow or severe infection can cause it to rupture. If that was to happen, we perform splenectomy, which means surgical removal of the ruptured spleen. It is though less commonly performed these days, as we have found out that the spleen has a remarkable ability to repair itself. As an example, in children younger than 12, spleen will regenerate even from a very small part, and it will not be necessary to perform this operation. If, however, spleen must be removed, liver and bone marrow can take over most of its functions, so there is a backup system in place. Let's have a look of tonsils. These are the simplest lymphoid organ. There are many tonsils which form a ring of lymphatic tissue around pharynx, and in appearance you could describe them as looking as swellings of mucosa. Tonsils are named according to their location. We have palatine tonsil at the posterior end of the oral cavity. This is the largest and most commonly infected one. We also have lingual tonsil, which is a lumpy collection of follicles at the base of a tongue. Pharyngeal tonsil instead is located in the posterior wall of nasopharynx. And finally, tubal tonsils. These surround openings of auditory tubes into pharynx. So tonsils' function is to gather and remove pathogens in food and air. I think that many of us have seen this clinical condition, tonsillitis. So tonsillitis is an inflammation of two oval-shaped pads of tissues at the back of the throat. And it is usually caused by a viral infection, but many also result from bacterial infection. Some type of typical symptoms include repeated sore throats, difficulty with swallowing, and sensitive lymph nodes. Some of us may have had to turn to tonsillectomy, where the tonsils get removed if an individual has a tendency of having constant tonsillitis. This is becoming less common though. Now, let's talk a little bit about structure called Peyers patches. These are clusters of lymphoid follicles located in the wall of distal portion of the small intestine. Their structure is similar to that of the tonsils, which we just looked at. And finally, I want to mention about their function. They destroy bacteria, preventing them from reaching the intestinal wall. They also generate memory lymphocytes. Now, I want to talk a few words about appendix. It is an offshoot from the first part of the large intestine, cecum, and in terms of the structure, it as well contains a large number of lymphoid follicles. Its functions are just like those of what we saw earlier, destroying bacteria, preventing them from breaching intestinal wall, and generating memory lymphocytes. And I keep finding all sorts of things that there are available at online. Even a soft toy of an appendix. I imagine that it may be useful when talking to a child about an appendix if she or he has to get it removed. And on that note, here is an amazing cartoon by the Awkward Yeti. So we do not fully know the role of the appendix, but the current theory is that it is an evolutionary remain from when we ate more plant-based material. And this is where the bacteria that break down this were stored. And as we have moved more and more away from this kind of diet, it has shrunk, but still stays there as a reminder of our evolutionary past. Another thing to note is that appendix can of course get inflamed. And I am sure all we have heard about someone that we know with who this has been an issue. And in this case, it may be that we remove someone's appendix surgically. Let's look at thymus. This is an interesting one in my view as an anatomist. It is made of 2 lobes, so it's called a bilobed organ. And it is located in the interior neck, extending to the mediastinum and partially overlaying the heart. The main function of the thymus is the maturation of T cells. What makes it interesting for us anatomists is that it is most active and largest in size during your childhood, but then gets smaller and gets replaced by connective tissue and fat. It still produces immunocompetent cells during this time, but just more slowly. So when I dissect an adult, I rarely get to see a striking thymus as I would when I would be if I would be working with a child. So, that's it for this chapter. I hope that you have found these videos useful as you review your lecture material.